Lakeland Public Television presents Currents with host Ray Gildow. Sponsored by Nisswa Tax Service, offering tax preparation for individuals and businesses across from the City Hall in Nisswa and on the web at nisswatax.com.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Lakeland Currents, where today we're talking about American education and international perspective. And my two guests today have probably some of the most unique experiences of any people that I've ever met before. And so they're going to give us, I think, some real insight into how other systems operate in other countries and what some of these other countries think about our educational system too. Just to give you a few tidbits here before I introduce my guests. In trends, we're 11th in fourth grade math in America, we're 6th in fourth grade reading, and we're 23rd of 65 in science scores in the world. We're 54th in educational expenses, and we're 9th in internet access. And I think the dichotomy here is that, and as our standings aren't very good in some of these areas, we're still one of the most innovative, technologically advanced countries in the world. And so sometimes it seems like our institutions are having a hard time keeping up with all the technology that's advancing, which is part of the whole dilemma, I think, that we face in this country. So, looking forward to this discussion. My guests today are Dr. Tom Kajer, who has been in 10 different countries, and I'm going to have him talk a little bit about what those are. And Bob Gross, who is the Interim Superintendent of Schools in Brainerd and was the Superintendent of Schools in Brainerd long before he went to become Superintendent of Schools in all these other places. So welcome, gentlemen. And
Thank you.
Maybe we could just start out with Tom. Maybe you could just give us a little of your background, and then we'll look at Bob's background.
Okay, well, I was a faculty member of CLC in Staples before it was CLC.
Central Lakes College.
Central Lakes College. Before it was Central Lakes College, it was Staples Vocational Technical Institute. But then I ended up going overseas on a number of assignments. Right after college, or 1 year after college, my wife and I joined the Peace Corps. And with that experience kind of caught the bug for international work. And so every now and then I would take an assignment overseas. And so I ended up working in about 10 countries. And sometimes with my family, sometimes without. Some of the longer ones were, we spent 5 years in India and 4 years in Kenya. I was in Pakistan 3 different times, and my last job was in Pakistan, which was a project manager of a World Bank project for 2 years. And some of the other countries for 3-month assignments and so forth. But anyway, that's my experience, and most of my work, particularly in the latter years, was in water management training and water management irrigation and so forth. So that's my experience.
Okay. And Bob, you, how long were you superintendent of schools in Brainerd before you made your career change?
Okay, I was superintendent of schools for 18 years in Brainerd. I spent 31 years here in Brainerd from 1968 to 1999, and then superintendent from 1981 to 1999. And then at that time we decided to try the international scene. I wanted to stay in the business I knew and loved, which was education, but try it in the private sector. And so, and as long as we're making that switch, well, why not also go international? Do 2 things at once. Move into the private sector and also stay in the business that I knew, but do it in an international scene. And so in 1999, I accepted a job as the superintendent of schools at Singapore American School in Singapore, and was there for 8 years. And then the Department of State in Washington, D.C., I was hired there with the Office of Overseas Schools, which was under the auspices of the Department of State. And I had responsibility then for calling on international schools in Western and Eastern Europe. And so for 5 years I traveled in Europe for 14 weeks out of the year typically. Yeah. And so that was a really nice experience. And then I decided to leave that, and the American Community School in Abu Dhabi needed some help. And so we went and worked there at the American Community School in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. It's the capital of the United Arab Emirates. And then following that, we took an assignment as superintendent of schools at the American International School in Vienna, Austria. And then last year we came back and enjoyed the grandchildren a little, and then Brainerd, their superintendent, left them, notified them in May that he was leaving, and it was really too short a window for the school board to do an appropriate search for this fall. And so they asked whether I wouldn't come back and serve as the interim superintendent here in Brainerd. And so that was very nice to be able, after 16 years, to come back and reconnect with the community here. That was part of my life for 31 years.
I didn't realize it had been 16 years.
Yeah, 16 years, right.
Gone. And I'll bet you found, I think all of these communities are living organisms. I bet it's changed a lot, hasn't it, since
Yeah,
you were here?
that was very unusual, because in some respects it felt like I had just taken the summer off and I could go right back to work. And yet, as you started getting into things, it's amazing how many things changed in the community and in the school. Yeah, so that's been quite a revelation. Very interesting to step back into it and, and go forward from here.
Well, and I've known both of you for quite a while, and I'm being a former educator myself. I think when we've been in education, we never lose our interest in education, educating people and kids. And so it's kind of nice to see that you guys are still, I know, Tom, you do a lot of volunteer work and a lot of different things, and you haven't had a chance to really completely catch your breath except for one little short period of time.
Well, right.
You're right back in the soup again.
Well, it's always nice to kind of test yourself, to see, okay, given what you think you've accomplished there and experienced, you always hope that you pick up some wisdom along the way too. And does that just work in one setting, or can you replicate that in another setting and, reestablish yourself? Because you have to start, even though in one place, you've established a lot of trust perhaps with the faculty and community, the next place you move to doesn't care about that. You start all over again, and that was a very interesting experience for me, because at first, when people, issues would come across the desk and I'd say, well, here's the way you do this. And people wouldn't accept that so readily. Well, listen, I know this is the way to do it because I've done this so many times in a previous life, right? And just to, again, having to test yourself like this and reestablish trust, because that's so much of leadership is trust, because you don't get people to move forward with you unless they really trust you, so I thought that was a great experience for me, and I continue to be intrigued by that whole leadership need, because
I bet you do. Yeah.
Coming back here, 80% of people are no longer here that were here 16 years ago on the faculty.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It really is. And you made an interesting comment about the size of Shanghai,
Singapore.
or Singapore rather,
Yes.
and how many Americans live there. Could you just make a comment?
Sure,
about that?
Singapore is a country, independent country. They got their independence from the British, in the early 60s. And then Malaysia took over for 3 years. But then in 1965, they got their independence as an independent country. And you could place all of Singapore easily within Crow Wing County.
Wow.
Yeah, Crow Wing County is larger than Singapore. But Singapore has 4.5 to 5 million people in it.
Wow.
In that small area. And it has worked out very, very well for them. And there are about 18,000 Americans living there. And many times we don't know this as Americans. And then, of course, that's not unique to Singapore, because we have so many Americans living in all of these countries, as Tom well knows, right? Having experienced that. Singapore happened to be a country and where it was a very safe and clean place, so and there was a rule of law. So our companies, like whether it's Hewlett-Packard, Dell Computer, Citibank, ExxonMobil, they could easily come over there. The government would tell them, here's what we'll do for you. And they could trust that that rug won't be pulled out from under them. And so it became a real attractive area for our regional headquarters internationally, so for so many of these companies. And of course, these companies, then they set up there, they bring their executives over there. Their executives bring their families with them. And their families have to have a place to send their children to school. And that's, of course, the school, again, one of many, where I was at, the Singapore American School. These are not government schools. These are private independent schools, and totally tuition-based. So if you wanted to implement a program or whatever else, you'd have to go to the parents, and the parents would decide, whether the tuition should be raised or shouldn't be raised for a given program. And the schools I was at, typically we served 50 to 54 different nationalities. So even though it's called an American school, I mean, there are people from all countries that wound up attending these schools. You know, so it's very internationally mixed. Yeah.
Well, the writer Thomas Friedman is stating that what's really interesting about what's happening in our world today is that we have the very chaotic parts of the world where people are fleeing quickly to get to the more organized parts of the world, to get out of that danger. You know, Somalia and Iraq and in those kinds of places. And that hugely impacts everyone's educational model.
Sure.
Some of the countries don't welcome immigrants and they aren't dealing with those issues, but America always has had this immigration issue, and we've always had integration into our communities. And I think when we look at our standings in the world of education, I don't know that a lot of people give our teachers and our educators credit for what they're dealing with and all the cultures they're dealing with, the languages they're dealing with. It's really a challenge. Wouldn't you agree that that's one of the things we're dealing with in this country?
Yeah, of course. And I'll let Tom react to that first, if you care to, Tom. And
Well, I would just a lot of the figures that we hear in the new media, of course, are the results of this international the PISA test, which is a program for international student assessment, and this is a set of tests that is given to about 60 countries every 3 years, and it's administered by the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic and
cooperative development. Yeah.
Development. And the thing that seems to be alarming to people who don't really get into the details is that the United States ends up about in the middle of the pack. We're not at the top in terms of average scores. These assessments are given in 3 different areas. That's science and math and reading, with particular emphasis on math. And we're about in the middle. And the point is that really the devil is in the details, because if you look at some of what you were just mentioning, first of all, that among those 60 nations, we are one of the most diverse. You don't think of us that way, but in fact we are, with our huge Hispanic population and our recent groups. And of course here in Minnesota we have 2 big groups, the Hmong, first of all, who came here in large groups, and now the Somalis and so forth. And many of these, at least during the first generation, are learning English for the first time, and yet they're part of the education population. And so when you do a sample of the population of 15-year-olds across the nation, you're going to get all of that diversity in that population as well. And so of course some of the average scores are going to be brought down by that. But there's another reason I think that we have to look at the details, and that is that we not only have universal education, but we made a commitment decades ago to spend a great deal of emphasis on satisfying the needs of special needs children. And that includes, you know, physically handicapped, mentally handicapped, psychologically handicapped, children suffering from various forms of autism. You have a whole spectrum of children that need special attention. Well, that diverts you know, financial resources, teacher resources, facility resources, so forth. But along with that, we also require that all of those children are mainstreamed. They're part of the secondary school system in public schools. So they are part of the education population. And they are also in that sample. And that obviously affects the results of an average score, you know. How much, you can argue how much that is. Some critics said, well, there were too many low performers in the sample from the United States. I would say, no, there wasn't. That is a representative sample because it does include all these people. And I think we're proud of the fact that we are doing that sort of thing, but we are probably at the top of the heap in terms of what we do for special ed.
Definitely.
There's almost no other country that has made that kind of commitment. And in many of these countries, those kinds of students are shuffled off to a separate institution and they're just, you know, they're not included at all in the general education system. So we are very different from many of the countries, and consequently you have to look at those details when you start comparing one country to another.
What's your perspective, Bob?
Well, I think I would just echo everything that Tom has said in terms of how we've had to, in your comment about having to assimilate all of these various populations, and we're not nearly as homogeneous as many of the other countries that we wind up getting compared to. But the other thing, and I mentioned is I was in Singapore. Singapore, as he mentions with the PISA test, you will know that they're typically right up on top, 1, 2, or 3 in terms of their ranking. Now here's the thing. We can never expect to compete with that. Just culturally, it's just too different. The way the Asians are focused on math and science particularly. I mean, I'll give you just a little anecdote. I was sitting on a park bench in Singapore one day, and there was a man sitting next to me, and he said, "You see that night?" Oh, and he said to me, "How do you like the Singapore math program?" And I said, "Well," I said, "it must be pretty good because Singapore's always on top in terms of the international test scores." And he said, "Well, you see that nice house over there and that Mercedes in the driveway?" He said, "That's because of the Singapore math program." He said, "Because I'm tutoring every day after school and all day Saturday." He said, "And this is the money I've made from the Singapore math program because I have, these are children, their parents, I mean, they are just obsessed with performance in math and science." Our families, I mean, our culture is so different. We would never tolerate that when our children come out and leave school, that they go right on to a tutor, and then Saturday morning you're going to go to a tutor. And, well, you know, in Korea, I thought it was I think CNN had the special one evening where they showed the algebra schools were being closed at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night by the police, because these parents were just insisting that these kids wind up tutoring. If the law enforcement wouldn't have stepped in, why, they would have kept them there until midnight. Wow. You know, so there is this obsession with the math and science scores and whatever. So there isn't any way that our society can keep up with that. At the same time, you know, when I was at Singapore, we had the government officials coming up, and they wanted to send teachers up to observe our teachers, because you had mentioned this earlier about, I think, something about the entrepreneurial spirit, the innovative spirit that exists here. And other countries recognize this. And they're wondering, well, how is it that we can cultivate some of that in our own people? Because they focus a great deal on drill, you know, and just getting ready for these exams and the like. Whereas, you know, the American educational system, if you take a look at the way our teachers work with students, the skill of negotiations that our kids develop. You know, they challenge teachers. Do we have to do this homework tonight? You know, do we have to take this test? You know, there's always this respectful, but they always are pushing the limits. Well, that kind of stuff is rarely allowed in so many other countries. You know, the kids just sit there and they accept whatever the teacher is. And so this whole inquiry-based approach, investigative approaches that are used in classrooms, this is why you see our country being ahead in terms of innovation, you know, and entrepreneurial spirit that we create in our children. And other countries realize this, that this is happening, and how do they get away from a little bit of what they're doing and the way instruction takes place, and trying to, you know, take a look at more of the American educational system. And the other thing that's so unique about our American educational system is that we do believe in that whole child stuff. So we place a great deal of value on athletics and extracurricular activities, because we feel that you never know where a child finds himself or herself, right? It may be on the stage, it may be in the chemistry lab, or it may be on the football field, but somewhere a child is going to find that they're really good at something and start feeling really good about themselves, and then that spills into the academic area too, you know? And so we totally believe all of these opportunities ought to be presented. And again, if you take a look at the international schools, they are basically focused on the core academic areas. You know, and if you want something like athletics, and then, well, you got to join a community group of some time, or theater, or choir, or something of that nature. You know, so, I mean, this is uniquely American, and that's just why I have such confidence in what we're doing here, despite the fact that we may not be looking at us good on the test scores, you know? I mean, we're so interested always in looking at rankings, but some of this stuff can't be tested, you know? But I think the proof is in the pudding. Look at what's happening with our country in terms of the innovative and entrepreneurial spirit we have created. You know, and I think, in my view, the schools deserve a lot of credit for that. And I'd like to get into that a little bit too if we have time, you know? So, yeah.
I happened to catch the former mayor of Las Vegas talking about the value of immigrants in Vegas. And he said, you know, that, and we just had the last program we did was talking about that first round of immigrants don't have the money to buy a home, but the second one does, and then the third generation does. And he was saying, when we've had these folks come from a variety of countries to Las Vegas, that first round, they're maids in the hotels, they have menial jobs, but they're huge increases to the countries they've come from. But the second generations and the third generations have flourished in this country, And I think you're saying the same thing there.
Yes.
We are third in patents behind Korea and Japan. And our study is certainly not as rigid as those two countries.
No, clearly not. No.
Yeah.
Tom, you were going to say something?
Well, seconding what you described, what some of the students go through, and in some of the countries I worked in, the very same thing happens, even though it isn't for all of the population, because you still have, I mean, for instance, in India, you still have that huge population that is still in villages and so forth. But among the emerging middle class and in other countries I've been to, that same thing is there, where the parents are putting everything on that student. They're hoping that student will raise their social status by success. And so there's such parental pressure and even extended family pressure on that student to study. And they don't get a chance to be children, literally, because from morning until noon at least, they're in school. They don't usually have school lunches, so they'll go home and have lunch.
Yes.
And then after that, they go to a tutorial, which the parents have to pay for. And the pressure, especially in secondary school, is so great. And you know, they're pinning all their hopes on this child passing that final exam so he'll get a good place at a university. But a lot of them don't pass. And you have a huge spurt in suicides among that age group at that time. It's a huge disappointment for the whole family. And all that they've put in over those last 12 years is for naught. And so it's just a real depressing sort of, and I don't think we ever want to institute that kind of a system here.
That's right.
You know, we tend to, as you were saying, what I would call well-rounded education. That's what we call it, where we give our children chances to explore many different directions while they're in the education system. And if you, for instance, if you wanted to run for president under the proposal that you do away with all school sports, I mean, you wouldn't just lose the election, you'd be run out of the country, you know. And sometimes maybe we're a little bit overboard on that too.
Sure.
You know, I know my wife complains too. You know, you'll have a lot more people going to the football game than you will coming to parent-student days, and so forth. But that's where the community, you know, ties in with the education system. So
We're down to about the last 4 minutes. Fast. But I wanted to say that India is graduating more straight-A students than America has total students, which is the competition coming down the road. But Bob, we don't have a lot of time left, but you want to give credit to the schools, the work that they're doing here.
In terms of listen, I think one of the things I really took away from Singapore, and I'll give you a quick story. One of our teachers got picked up one morning by a taxi cab, okay, and taken to school, and the taxi cab driver said to her, "What is it that you do?" And she said, "I'm a teacher." And he went like this. He turned around and went like,
Wow.
That's the kind of reverence they have for educators there, you know, which really can. And here we do spend too much time sometimes bad-mouthing public education or teachers or whatever. You never see that kind of thing in the country, and nor did I see it in Abu Dhabi when I was there or in Vienna. And I think we have to be real careful. It's not all about money. But most of us, when we raise our children, we want them to go into a profession that's honored and respected and whatever. And so we have fewer and fewer people going into education. This is why this shortage is developing. And I say there's a fairly easy fix to this. Let's just start talking, proudly about the profession of education. And so young people see it as a really worthwhile profession. It isn't the money that's keeping people from not going there. Frankly, it's the respect for the profession. Exactly. And that's one of the things that we can learn from some of these other countries. We've still got such a great country, and when you travel abroad and live abroad, you develop a greater appreciation for your own country. I'm not sure why that happens to us, but it does. And so, when that happens, we also know that there are things we could learn from other countries. And this is just a little thing I took away from that, which is so critical, I think.
And you two have not had this discussion before, so I want everybody to know that
No.
you didn't even know each other
We did
before you
not.
sat down
Right.
here. But your perspectives from the international level are very, very similar.
Yes, right.
That we are doing a lot of the things.
I would just
right.
mention two things that I'm concerned about that you would take from looking at some other countries. One is early childhood education. We're talking about it here, but we're not doing a lot about it yet. But in some of these countries, 95, 96% of the children all go to early childhood schools even before kindergarten. And that's the time when the best learning takes place. Yeah. And particularly when you talk about reading, children learn to read up to about 3rd grade. After that, they read to learn. And we need to really stress that. The other thing I'd mention, if we have time, is language. In most of the countries being compared to, about 70% of the children in those countries speak 2 languages. Only about 20% in our country. And we need to, I think, look at that more just for the world of work coming up. And instead of teaching it in the high school, we need to be down in the grade schools when learning is best.
Yeah.
We're out of time. Great topic, great conversation. I hope that it helps our viewers get a perspective that things aren't as bad here as we're some.
Oh, no, really quite to the contrary.
Right. Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen, very much.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate
Yeah,
your
appreciate
insights.
being here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You've been watching Lakeland Currents. I'm Ray Gildow. We'll see you next time.